Hey, what's going on, guys? We are back with another of the matchup guide spread to go over three lists this time. The aggro list, which we've tried to update as much as we can for the pre-Rosetta format. Same with an aim hybrid, which Talia has said is basically the evolution of what the prior hybrid was. And then fatigue, which we'll be joined by with Talon later on at the end. The lists that we'll have in the description will be live up until after the Rosetta comes out, because then we'll just evolve into a new list. But for all those people that are trying to go to some like Realm Rumbles or whatever events are up until Rosetta comes out, this kind of acts as a good starting point. And even when Rosetta comes out, you can come back to this and kind of get a general idea of how things are going to go to evolve your list from there and see like where you need to start. Most of the spreads haven't changed all that much. A lot of it's just being updated with current lists and like how the builds are navigating. One of the things that we did change is that we turned. Oh, I don't know why it's zoomed in. Turned the mech dash IO mech into its own slot, and then this is like the aggro version, just to kind of make it a little easier. This Bravo build is the recent Pro Tour list that was running a bunch of D-Reacts. This is related to the other Riptide builds, because we all know the mirror's 50-50. And Decimator, as before, is just dedicated Decimator builds across the board on every warrior. So most of the matchups haven't really changed all that much. You have Arachne, who still pretty much hasn't changed. It's very, very difficult to lose. Bolton, who's still, after all the new stuff that's come out, they still trigger all your traps, and the nature of how they perform is pretty easy for Riptide to deal with. So it's still very unfavorable for the Bolton. Fi hasn't navigated too much. I've played against tons of Fi and like multitude of different builds, and it's just you just outdamage them, or you're just able to pivot and like cause issues on their turn cycles. Even after the ban, Katsu's still very favored, because even if you throw a bunch of damage at them, it doesn't matter what build they're running, they still go, oh, that's hard to block. Even their burst trains are still able to be dealt with about the same way. It's just that their ceiling has declined because of the bonds ban. Azuri has evolved into a little bit more of a predictable list that it makes it a little easier to actually navigate around her, and I really don't think it's. I think it's genuinely difficult to lose them, because all their stuff is much more heads up than new, so it's a lot easier to deal with what they throw at you. Um, in the heavily unfavored or the heavily favored, both of the Dory and Olympia are pretty much the same. They don't really navigate too much far from where they originally were. Enigma is kind of the same thing. I think they've started to tweak a little bit more towards more D-Reacts over time, which does make it slightly better than it was before, but it's still just a very, very hard matchup for Enigma. New, I've put a little bit lower than I had before, because they have a few builds that become a little difficult to deal with, and things can line up a little bit easier for them to automatically just make you go on your back foot. But traditionally speaking, it is still a very, very favored matchup, probably like 75% still. So I'm not too concerned about it. As before, Kasai is still very favored. However, they do still have the Centauri Sellswords, which become very difficult to deal with. So if they do resolve those, it becomes harder to actually make the match easy, because, well, they have a bunch of these allies that just keep attacking for free. Dash has moved down a little bit because they're running a little bit more of an aggressive list overall, and contrary to the hybrid and the fatigue list, uh, where they are fine with seeing aggro, the the pistol plan and the tree frog plan are very easy to deal with. The aggro plan is actually somewhat difficult to deal with for the aggro riptide, because of the blocking ability that we have. and in some respects they can just kind of ignore our damage and then send a higher number, and then we have to block them sooner because of just how much we block efficiently. It's still favored, very favored, but like it can get hairy really quickly. Uh, Dash IO, just because of the fact that they have just the aggro list, they can randomly spike you, and that's really the only reason why it's like here instead of up and heavily favored. But typically speaking, it's pretty easy to deal with because they block so poorly, and they have to like hyper roll you to be able to successfully do anything. KO is kind of in the same boat as opposed to a lot of other builds that are up here. KO is very favored, and it's like kind of difficult to lose. So I would put him at probably at about the 65% range, but it's still a brute, and he still randomly can just throw a curveball at you, and you just can't really do anything about it. Vincent's straightforward. You really shouldn't lose that. You don't really lose your arsenal. You don't care about the top of your deck. You can ABs to some capacity. You can stop on hits with uh, Moff's guys with your tar pits, or you can just block a little bit, and then your 2 card hands are just way better. It's just it's hard for them to actually catch up. I've talked about Prism before. I think Prisms are starting to wise up a little bit, so putting her a little bit closer to the middle here is better because just of that nature. But it's still a very favored matchup until they high roll you. But a lot of the builds are not correctly sideboarding into Riptide, where they try to run Vestige and try to high roll, which means you have a lower percentage overall. Instead of going with a Rapture, which has a overall consistent game plan, that becomes more difficult for Riptide to deal with. Because yes, the high roll does kind of win you the game sometimes. It's a lot harder to get off, and it leaves you a lot more volatile, especially to the aggro builds. But if you have the regular package of the Rapture and you build a little bit around it, then it becomes easier for Riptide to just randomly not do anything against you, and you just out aggro them pretty much, and you can just establish a huge amount of advantage. Azalea is a really funky matchup for this one because while technically we are pretty favored, there's just that random roll chance, and that is exactly why Azalea does what she does sometimes. It really is about like a 60% matchup until you hit Buzzsaw Trap, and then the moment you hit Buzzsaw Trap, it spikes up to like 75. Um, a big thing though is that Dreadbore makes things a little bit weird, but unlike the other builds that have her here because of Dreadbore, we have her here because of Death Dealer. If they run Dreadbore, this jumps up here. Because Dreadbore, we're not reliant as an aggro build on our traps to be able to actually take the matchup to the extreme. We are reliant on getting better numbers than you. So by running Dreadbore, you just have worse numbers. And then Riptide is able to jump in and just go, well, the aggro build is just able to swarm you. And then it becomes harder for you to block. But if you have Death Dealer, you have a higher ceiling, so therefore you can high roll us easier, which means aggro loses. So you end up playing a game of chicken where you're trying to find out which build the Riptide has, and that's where your percentages pretty much start going all over the place. Levi is just randomly, just like with KO, can randomly burst you, but because of her flip, it becomes a little bit more awkward because you have to hit her through certain points to be able to get her within reason. She's still not like unfavored, and she's probably closer to 55, 60, but she's just really can be awkward sometimes, especially with the new card. If they high roll you and they have variance on their side and the brute gods descend upon them, you're not doing really much about that. You're just probably losing. Bravo is in that same capacity where they can just absolutely steamroll you. However, the new builds are starting to run more D-reacts, which means that the Dreadbore plan, which is what we naturally run into them, is really efficient. And naturally, like even beforehand, we could fatigue them pretty okay as a regular aggro build just because of pure damage and how the build works. Now, because of the efficiency of the build and the way that they're running it, it's becoming easier, so that's why it's now in slightly favored. If they navigate into a more regular build, they start losing percentage points against heroes like New, but they gain huge percentage points in us. Don't think that they're giving up those percents, so we're fine. The other Riptide builds, because of Dreadbore, we can sound out a majority of our traps, except for the very, very key ones like Buzzsaw and Collapsing. and therefore we have a low density of traps, and Dreadbore doesn't affect us. While the hybrid and the fatigue builds literally have to run traps to meet 60, so it becomes really awkward for them because now they have dead cards in hand a lot of times. They have to navigate around. Well, we don't have that issue, and we have a higher damage density. So that's kind of where this like 55-ish% slight favored into those builds come from for the aggro build. Viscerai is just Viscerai. He's pretty easy to beat and navigate around, but like he's just can randomly roll your face in because he is Viscerai. But it's inconsistent and it doesn't happen often, but it's also dependent on the build. If they're running aggro, it's a little hairy. If they're running burst, you just destroy them because they usually have a lot more D-reacts and you just run Dreadborn to them. Betsy is awkward because Betsy by nature is not as hard to deal with, but she has a higher damage density, and unlike Bravo, she doesn't really run a huge amount of D-reacts. This is also like this build is so unknown that this percent is hard to deal with because you can't really track it down. You can't work around your percent of knowledge here. Zen is still 50-50 because it's an aggro mirror, but I would say if I were to literally give it the most accurate number I can, it's probably like 50-50, inching down to slightly unfavored. It's still an aggro mirror, and the way that I describe it is that leading up to when they transcend, you are starting to hit the favored point. The lower their life total goes, the more they block, the less resources they have, the more damage you deal, the more disruption you deal, the better that percent rises. But the moment they transcend, you start panicking. You now have to pivot your playstyle into trying to figure out what to do to try to prevent them from bursting. Once they burst, if you're alive and you're above 20 life, you're starting to inch that percent back. So it's just that weird curve where you have to survive specific points and hope that everything lines up for it to go well. But the moment that it doesn't go well, you've lost the game. And I know that sounds kind of arbitrary to say, but like that's really how it is. Reiner is awkward because we really do not block well as aggro by nature. And if they hit our traps, then we just can't block the way that we want to, and we have to give up our power cards or our attacking cards to be able to actually not die in some cases. That's really where that matchup comes from. It's just awkward, and sometimes the blocks make things bad. And because the game goes so long, typically they have the ability to randomly spike you sometimes because they typically run like more of a mid-range package. That's really where that comes to. Both of the mech builds are difficult because the overpower is kind of annoying to deal with in such a way that they can just like power spike you. And if you do not line up with traps, then you can't deal with the block value and the pure just damage they deal. So once they transform, it just becomes difficult. It's kind of the same with him. Uh, Victor is still awkward. I would say that he used to be like 25%, and like you could win, but like it was rough. Now it's probably closer to 35% where like because we have Stone Rain and stuff like that, it becomes easier to end games, and the games become closer. They're still just rough. Same. We also can never win a clash. It's just impossible with the way that our deck's built. It's kind of the same with Decimator Pure build where it becomes awkward with how we have to block, and they can easily fatigue us. But we have more tools now, so it's like it used to be like 20%. Now it's probably like 25-30%. Uh, it might be better now that we have a little bit more density in the deck and less traps overall, but it's still rough, and it's still a huge, massive skill check. This is a matchup you absolutely have to skill gap for it to really be decent. Kano, you have to high roll. You have to hope that they low roll. That's really it. There's not much else in the matchup. You're running primarily a red line deck, so you can't AB worth Garb. And even then, we cut like down to one AB. So like realistically, this matchup's do they low roll and do you high roll? Yes, okay, you might win it. I think 20%, if not 15%, is pretty accurate. Tekla, on the other hand, I've yet to win a Tekla match. I do not think that Aggro has the capability to win against a good, competent Tekla. If they are bad, maybe you win. But by nature, I think that matchup is probably the closest to 0% that this deck has. Overall, Aggro is a pretty good placement in the meta, but when Rosetta comes, it's probably going to get strictly worse because of the fact that the AB is going to become more prevalent, and we have to cut and change out the deck to actually cater to the AB, which will drop some of these percentages down immediately. And I don't think we can still plan for Kano. So what it basically does is pushes some of these down immediately, maybe consolidates these into a little bit more of a even split, and then throw Rune Blades and Wizards in the mix, which the Wizards will probably end up being like right here. Overall, like what's your thoughts on how aggro has been looking?
It it's still effective. It's still like I wouldn't say the way to play competitive Riptide, but like I only say that because I don't play it, but like it is. Like I'll be honest, it's the most successful build so far. So it's without a doubt probably one of the stronger builds in Riptide we've seen, and that's the reason why not much of it has changed significantly too. It's like pretty solved. And
Yeah,
it's getting to a majority of the field too, so it's just a no-brainer.
post Rosetta, with the inclusion of a lot more wizards and a lot more rune blades, I think that there's a potential for hybrid to improve a lot because they have a higher density of resources, as well as I would say more flexibility on their sideboards. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a high probability that hybrid becomes the dominant build with Rosetta coming.
More
But we can,
pitch for AB.
yeah, more pitch AB, more flexibility on the slots. They don't need to have the arms. They can have bullseye bracers to like function through their build. While the aggro list that we're currently working on kind of needs the arms to be able to navigate through and like gain value off of, and to assure that we have the value off of things like Stone Rain. So going to aim, I'll go ahead and let Tally take over on his side of things, and we can like talk a little bit more about it afterwards.
Yeah, so obviously the hybrid list has evolved quite uniquely. We've always wanted to play aim builds, so I naturally went to trying more of the aim stuff. Just finding out in the Zen match that we needed more disruption, and it just ended up actually being pretty good. And then the Azalea deck came out, and it was just even better. So this is going to be going over my new aim build that hybrid has evolved into. So first, I just want to touch on one thing: is like the hybrid build was called hybrid before because it had a mix of blocking attacks and go again in order to fluctuate between aggressive turns versus defensive turns. So this isn't hybrid in the way where it'll have go again. It doesn't go wide at pretty much at all, minus the boots. But it will have the option to be aggressive on hands and defensive on hands in the same way hybrid did. It just does it very differently. It does it with more, go talls and avoidable buffs, kind of like Fletch and stuff like that. So basically been testing it nonstop since Canadian Nats and a little bit after, a little bit before. So these are the matchup that I have settled on for now. So I'm not going to go over too much of it because it's going to be very similar to what you described already on the aggro build in terms of like why we're good into who we're good into. But the main differences are going to be like Azuri, for example, like I said, I haven't lost into an Azuri yet, and I see everyone's on that new Azuri. So basically, they're running, I believe, 3 sinks, 3 fates, and 3 inertia traps, and some are running frailty traps too. So basically, we just get so much value into Dreadbore into that match, and our traps obviously come big too with the ability to stop their turns because they have the effect that they use the what's it called, her ability that is a reaction. So we have all that. So basically, everything she does is going to trigger our traps for the most part. So once we full stack all the traps, run Dreadbore, we're good. Then we get into more of these mid heavily favored guys. So Katsu again, just he can be Katsu, and I think we're in an awkward spot with Katsu as well, where they're trying to figure each other out as well. So basically, I've seen some builds that I'm like, oh, cool, they're like doing some unique stuff that can go up and over my blocks, and other things that can kind of like throw me off. I don't know if that match is just in that position right now because we don't know what it's gonna do yet, and then when they start like finalizing their decks and making it more streamlined to what they want to do, then maybe that match becomes hard to lose again, just because we can expect what we're going to expect versus right now we don't know what we're going to expect. New can just high roll. I mean, it's very rare, but it can happen. When she high rolls, if we don't have traps, then we just have to take it. If she ends up taking, a massive bonds turn and she gets our codexes or something that we need in the match, it can hurt. But I think I've only lost 1 or 2 of these matches on this list. And that was just because they were playing a completely different list than I was used to, and I didn't have Dreadbore at the time. But ever since I've run Dreadbore into them, I've had no problems. KO is he can KO, he can high roll, but it's very, even when he high rolls, I'm still able to block him out because he's very resource intensive when he wants to high roll. So if we just take advantage of that and play a good value game, we pretty much can beat them here. And also every single pretty much aim counter arrow will really affect him. He's got a massive fridge. Drill shot's really good with that early game, as is the boulder trap. And on top of that, obviously, we have immobilizing shot and murky, which is really good for late game closers. We have Kasai. So I haven't seen a Kasai in the wild in a while, but I played my buddy's Kasai a couple times, and I've also played maybe 1 or 2 on Talishar, and they seem like they haven't really evolved much. They're the same build, so this is going to be the same idea as hybrid, where they trigger all our traps and they just run themselves into us, and if we just survive them, then we just come back harder. The one thing I found in the aim build that makes it a little bit better than the hybrid build is we can be a little bit more disruptive to them as well, so that's pretty good. Also, battering bolt. Battering bolt is super fun to use against a warrior because they just have to give you their full hand if you have buffs on it. Then dash, same thing, as they just run into all our traps. We side out the ones that don't matter. They run into all the ones that matter while we're able to disrupt them. Every single disruption matters into this match. Immobilizing hits, battering hits, murky always hits. The new stone rain is really good into it too. So this is just a fun match now because of all our new tools. Dash original, same thing, basically the exact same thing, just gonna trigger everything and run into us. Enigmas are in a weird spot too, I find, just because they're still learning what they want to do as well. I've had one Enigma that actually was a problem where what's that, 10,000 year, I think it's called? He basically just kept that out and kept swinging for 10 and doing nothing else and blocking me out. But then that's when I started putting in the pitfall traps so I could trigger those. And yeah, ever since I've done that, that's not a problem anymore because pitfall will always triggering to kill the 10,000 year. So once I did that, that matchup became super easy. I have a local that's strictly on Enigma, and he's obsessed with Enigma, and he hates this matchup, and he's a good player too. So I don't think it's a matter of skill gapping. I think it's literally just Riptide is pretty favored into this matchup. Then we get into the slightly favored. So we have Azalea. So Azalea can still do Azalea things. They can still high roll beyond belief. But when they don't do that, it's pretty good. We have more traps, so we can consistently block them out.
As
If
opposed to
they...
aggro.
Pardon?
As opposed to aggro.
Yeah. They run Dreadbore. I actually had one run Dreadbore against me last time, and I only sided in the relevant traps anyways. So I had Inertia, Boulder, and Pitfall, and I never ran into an issue where I was screwed and had to block because Dreadbore, they significantly lower how much power they can output in a turn to the point where it kind of offsets that trap in your hand every now and then. They're only coming in for 7 or 10 max, and then you can just block out. Then on top of that, you can swing back for all the disruption that hits them because they don't like immobilizing. They don't really care about battering, but they care about all the other ones. They care about getting hit because you're just going to outvalue them with life, especially if you do little pokes and block out everything. I found the best thing into this match as well is if they have something non-dominated, you just block it out, and then you basically are only going to take the dominated arrow hurts, in which case you're probably going to outvalue them with life totals in the end. Then on to the Rhinar one. So the Rhinar one only has a slight advantage because he can intimidate traps from our hand, stopping us from blocking, and he can force us to block with arrows or stuff like that if it's going to be a lot of damage, in which case we'll then lower our turn. But if that doesn't happen, then yeah, we just pretty much steamroll him. We go over him pretty hard in this list because he has a lot of buffs and he has a lot of armor, so Boulder Trap and Inertia come in playing here. And then on top of that, I do have a sideboard of balance, so we can take advantage of the draw from the Blood Rush Bellows. Same goes for Levia. Levia is the exact same logic here. She does go a little bit more harder because she has the higher roll potential. Levias can go pretty high, but if they flip to the consume phase, then I just find that you just can fatigue them if you just block out and just play smart, poke them a little bit, and try to preserve life totals early game. And then when they slip, you basically just have to wait a couple turns until they deck out. Vincent's weird just because again, Vincent's also going through a weird phase where they don't know what they want to build either. Like I fought some fatigue Vins, I fought some aggressive Vins, and I've never had like a crazy issue into them. Trench is huge into this match because obviously we run a lot of blues now, well, a lot more blues, so we can usually get rid of a lot of that rune chant stuff. And then on top of that, the aim counters, literally all of them disrupt and all of them hurt them. They run D-Reacts as well, so Dreadbore is huge into that match. I just found that this match is just a blatant decent match. Like there's nothing crazy for them to do to us that I find is like too bad. But every now and then, if they high roll that I forget the one that makes it banish a card from your hand. If they high roll like two of those together, that kind of hurts. But other than that, it's like it's pretty fine. Bravo's slightly favored now just because we have more ways to dominate and go through his blocks. On top of that, he runs a lot of D-React, so Dreadbore. So we just, this match got better since the Azalea deck. We have so many new ways to load and give aim and create dominate. Betsy, same thing with Betsy as Bravo. It's just, I find that Betsy's don't run as many D-Reacts, so they have a little bit more aggression, because I find that the aggressive Guardians that can flip between aggressive and blocking are the harder ones to deal with in Riptide. So they don't run as many D-Reacts, they just run more 3 blocks, so they can swap between, coming in for 6, coming in for 9, or just full blocking out, and they don't have to worry about Dreadbore as much. But it's still 50-50 because again, like you can get crazy hands that just disrupt them and cause them to lose a lot. Especially if you hit them with a dominated Deadeye, then you can just take their card from hand, the only card they could play, and that most they can pretty much just Arsenal and pass or swing hammer. In which case, that's not much. This is the same thing where it's it's just a fatigue match. It's just, well, as long as it's the one turn kill. The one that stacks rune chants and all that. Basically, if you see them doing that, you just go aggressive as you can in the early stage and then try to preserve life totals so you can survive their aggressive turns. I had a couple Viscerais come at me with, I think they had 20 stacked rune chants, and I just ended up taking them all and just still won because by that turn in the game, they only had like 20 life left anyways, so it was already in a 20 life lead roughly. So, and I run Sigil, so Sigil's pretty big as well. So basically, I just try to preserve as much life early game and then come at them late game with dominate things they can't, get around. Also, Dreadbore. The Dash mech match. So this match is going to be 50-50 for now, but once that new card comes out, I'm pretty sure this will be favored, just because a lot of them like to sit on the Mac and wait for the optimal turn to use it. So, the new card just prevents them from doing that, either forcing them to do it early, or it forces them to just lose it. So I find that match is going to be huge after that. As of right now, they trigger a lot of our traps. They have potential to high roll us, but we also have Battering Bolt, which helps a lot into the match because they can lose a lot of those items. And basically, this is just a match of like
the items don't get discarded off of Battering Bolt.
Oh right, yeah.
Yeah, you're thinking of Weakest Link.
Yeah, you're right. Either way, the match is just basically who gets their pieces together first. And then same for Zen. Zen can just do Zen. He just is Zen. He's annoying, but is what it is. I find that actually in the Zen match, a big percentage increase has been Boulder Trap, just because right now the match, the way it plays out is you basically have to arsenal a face-up arrow and wait for a time that you can buff it to go up and over their armor. Otherwise, they're just going to block with armor and then they go off. They can't really go off unless they block with armor. So if you don't send anything at them that they basically have to block, then you can basically just wait them out, and then once you get that battering up and over like 9 or 10 damage, then they're forced to block from their hand as well as their armor, and then that takes away from their power turn not being as powerful. So Boulder really helps into that match because it lowers that threshold damage number that you need in order to send something at them. So if you Boulder 2 or 3 times early game, then that battering bolt or whatever it is in Arsenal only has to come in for like 5 or 6 at that time. It doesn't have to go for 7 or 9. And then even eventually they have to come out with more cards in hand that they have to block with, in which case, that's just they're not going to go off if they only have 2 cards in hand. So that's basically how that match plays out, but it can still be rough if you don't get the boulders, if you don't get battering, if you don't have the right arrows at the right moment, then yeah, you just lose this. But if you do, then you win it. So it's literally 50-50. Prism can do Prism things. She's annoying. She has ALS loop, and we play slower, so she can take advantage of setting up that ALS loop. We have a lot of traps, so if they trigger them, we can pop the angels if they're flipped. So we have that element, which is a little bit okay. Also, battering bolt helps into this match too because we can take all their instants away. But it's just us. This is like basically a skill match and a match of whoever gets, the better draws, kind of. Because if you don't see a tar pit trap for like the first half of the game, then you're basically just fucked, and they're gonna have a crazy board state. But as soon as you see one of those, you can kind of flip the game and you can take control. But it's until you run into that one crappy turn where you draw all buffs and no arrows, and you have no traps that can kill you. So again, 50-50 based on the draw. So Riptide is aggro Riptide. So I'm kind of like undecided how this match is. I want to test it more just to find out. I'm not convinced it's like completely slightly unfavored, but yeah, we'll see. Alithos thinks that it's going to be unfavored slightly because you guys will run less traps, which will mean you guys can go faster and wider, which makes sense. But I feel like the disruption might counterbalance that, but I'm not 100% yet. Going based off the old hybrid list, this is what it was set at before, was slightly unfavored. So I'm okay to just put it into that for now, and then I'll test it more and find out. But I have a feeling it's at least a little bit better than the hybrid list was.
It was like 45-55. It's like
Yeah.
very slight, but I think it's like that has the edge. Um, what about fatigue? What's your thoughts on the fatigue?
The fatigue match, well, they run every D react possible, so Dreadboard just shuts them down. They also don't have enough arrow density to really like go up and over. So if they're running Dreadbore, we only side in a couple of traps, and then we can just be more aggro and more disruptive. Especially if I get that turn where I have a dominated Deadeye, I can take away their only arrow, and now they're forced to just Arsenal pass, and then they have a hand of all D reacts. They can't do anything. They block with one D react in Arsenal, and then I send whatever I can at them. Like that match will be probably pretty favored for the aim list. I think it's the same with the aggro list. Like you guys are going to dominate into that matchup too.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Max. So Max is pretty good. The only big downside is this: he has more blocks than the dash. So if they block, set up mech, go slow, and then eventually they all can do the high octane mech stuff, that's gonna suck. But if they don't do that and we get enough disruption that we can take away their mechs, then we're in a good spot. But that's a lot harder than like a 50-50 match. Like that's not a matter of luck of the draw. That's a matter of perfectly aligning our cards with their cards. So if that happens, we can win. If that doesn't happen, then I find it's just in a matter of hoping that you win. I have beat a couple maxes, but I've also lost to a couple. So it's one of those things that I just think it's slightly unfavored because the mech's just super powerful. I do like though that boulder trap can trigger on the mech and prevent the mech from blocking as much. But again, yeah, it doesn't really help it as much. Victor's like he's really cool because he's just such an aggressive guardian that can also swap, like I was saying, between the fatigue blocking out and then the aggression. The only thing that makes this match slightly unfavored is cast home. If they cast home CNC, cast home CNC, cast home CNC late game, then yeah, we just lose. If they don't do that, then I think that we can fatigue victors consistently as long as they don't do that. But that's tricky. So you have to hope that basically you're aligning, your dead eyes to take away their cast homes or CNCs or other things like that, which again is going to be tough to do, which is again why it's slightly unfavored. I find that Hybrid had an easier time into this match because it was before he had cast home. Now that he has cast home, I think Hybrid would have done bad too. So I think it's just a matter of that match just got significantly worse with cast home. But I find that the aim build can handle old Victor without cast home better. But with cast home, we're just kind of screwed. So we just have to hope that it doesn't line up properly and they can't really utilize it as well. But that's why, yeah, it's slightly unfavored because of that garbage. Teklo, Teklo can just, Singularity is pretty tough to deal with. We can't really disrupt enough to take it away. Like, again, we have to have Deadeye line up when it's in their hand. They're never going to allow it to sit in hand longer than one turn. They're either going to pitch it away or arsenal it. We don't have much arsenal disruption because I took out the CNC, so we can't really do anything other than sedation shot or seek. If they say seek, they're probably going to throw their armor in front of it. If they see sedation, then oh well, inertia. They can just wait until it comes back. We play such a mid-range slow game that they can basically set up pretty good. So it's a pretty tough match. The only thing that really helps this match again is Boulder Trap, just because it takes away their block density, but it's still like not really that big of a deal.
That new
Especially since
card is going to be really funny.
yeah, the new card will be huge. Like that'll probably affect the matchup a lot. So obviously I'm excited to see that, but as of right now, yeah, it's heavily unfavored. It's just a rough match. Luckily, he's not really big on the meta. Then yeah, Decimator, same exact thing. The only thing I think that's better into the Decimator here is like Battering Bolt Loop Endgame is like significantly better and more easier to do in this build. So they run a lot of D-reacts, obviously. So if we can eventually get them to pitch some of them, and then when we see them come back around, or we know they're coming back around, if we can get a battering out, pump it up, and get them to discard those, I think we can consistently fatigue Decimator. I just have to test it more in order to find out for sure if that's possible, but I have a feeling that that's possible. But as of right now, I'm just going to put it in heavily unfavored because it seems to be, it's a pretty tough build for all the Riptides. I just have a feeling that I might be able to increase this matchup percentage, but no one's playing Decimator right now, so it's hard to test it. Kano, we don't even talk about Kano. Like, we have no way to go up and over him. We have no way to go around. We have no way to stop his crap. We have no way to do anything. I think ever since Kindle came out, a lot of people are like, oh, we should put in Spellvoid, we should put in Oasis. And all the Kano players are just like, that's not going to help. Like, that doesn't do anything. They can do upwards of 60 to 80 damage on turn 3 if the cards line up. And more than not, the cards are lining up pretty consistently. And every Kano that has beat me with this build has said, oh, I'm about to die. Well, let's see what I can do. And I'll be at near full health. And then they'll output like probably close to 40 to 60 damage. Like there's just nothing you can do anymore. This match is ridiculous. Kano's playing a different game. He's in his own world. I don't know how he's still around in the game. I don't know how he hasn't won more events. I guess it's because aggro keeps him in check, but that deck has gotten absolutely ridiculous with Kindle. Yeah,
So,
that's
so
my
in
spread.
general, obviously we haven't talked about the fatigue list yet, but in general, the pre Rosetta format. What's your thoughts on the quote unquote better deck?
Yeah,
Um,
so we were talking a little bit about this before we went into this, like obviously off when we weren't recording. So I think just like right now, they're both really good into the majority of the field. So it's all personal preference. If you want to play a fatiguey, mid-rangey, value-oriented deck, then I think Aim's the way to go. But I will admit it is probably the hardest build to pilot, at least from my experience. It's super difficult because it's super nuanced with like the instant speed loading, the trap loading into flipping for barb to then instant speed load another arrow, like things you can do that are like crazy shenanigans. Also, knowing when to properly use your gloves and boots is pretty big. So I think that's like a lot of steep learning curve. So if you're new to the deck, pick up aggro. It's a little bit easier to play, and it shows you a little bit of like what Riptide's crazy shit he can do, and it kind of gives you that light Lexi feeling as well. So if you like Lexi, then yeah, go that route. But I think if you want to play mid range and you want to have like a long grindy game where you have a lot more decisions to make, I think Aim's the way to go. They both have very similar matchups right now into the field. I think like they're both 50-50 into Zen. They're both pretty well into new KO and Enigma. Who else is? Yeah, Azalea. They're both like okay into Azalea. Like I think that we're in a pretty good spot with both these builds. I think this build significantly feels better into the current meta than the old hybrid list did. The old hybrid list just instantly lost to Zen. Like Zen would up and over. It was just too hard to block him out. It also wasn't that good into Prism at all. It also was like it was okay into KO and Enigma. It actually did really well into them, but I think new it'd be tricky. Like they have a lot more blocks like in the hybrid list, so they could block out more of new stuff. But I think if she played smart and pitch stacked and like didn't worry about the blocks early game and just made you waste them, then she could probably come at you harder late game. Whereas with the aim ones, we can disrupt and take those power cards away from them. And then with aggro, it's too fast; they have no time to think. So I think like they're in both really good spots right now with both these lists. I think
My,
that's why we see success on both of them.
my thoughts is that if you are confident that there's not going to be many prisms, and whatever event you're going to, pre Rosetta, whatever event, I think that aim is better because I know you said that Zen is 50-50, but I feel like it's slightly more than that because your build has a more consistent spread on how it can deal disruption and deal with and has a higher density of block value. So I think that your leverage on Zen is strictly better. You're obviously strictly better into Victor, so if you feel there's going to be Victors, you have a better KO matchup, and you have a slightly better Assassin matchup. So I think that big the big indicator of whether or not you play aim versus aggro is how many illusionists. Plus, I think you have a slightly better Azalea matchup depending on how the Azalea plays. But
Yeah,
for we can ignore that for the most part. But like the illusionist and Zen is like illusionist Zen and Victor are the big like changes. If you do not feel that there's going to be enough Prism, the Enigma is close enough. But if you think there's going to be a lot of Zen, a few Victor, then I think that aim is strictly better.
yeah. I mean, it's of course like when we're
But
comparing
it's
those to
harder.
Riptide builds, but if you're going to an event and there's a lot of Victor, you probably don't want to bring Riptide.
True, true. But you're not going to escape it.
Yeah,
So if you were to like pick, yeah, like this is just better. But end all be all, this is a harder list, like you were saying, to navigate around. I actually ran it a few times and tried to understand it, and I could. It's just it fries like normal muscle memory that you've established that you have to like kind of reorient yourself.
yeah,
So I think if you were like to say, "Hey, I have an event in 2 weeks. I need to jam games and get to know exactly what I'm doing from zero," then you're just going to bring aggro because you're going to get to the point of mastery faster than the aim counter build, which requires a lot more nuances and understanding of very specific and particular hands and play patterns. While aggro doesn't quite need that as much, it's pretty straightforward because the patterns are similar. Not that it's easy to learn, it's that there's only a few play patterns and you just got to distinguish which one's best. While the aim build, the play patterns in itself start branching off way more. Would you say that's probably correct?
yeah. And there's a lot of different ways to play aim too, so we're still like figuring it out.
Hey guys, we are here with Talon right now. He's going to go over the fatigue build after me and Tally went over all the other stuff. I'll just kind of let him rip.
Yeah, great to be here. I think this is my first time actually popping on to the
Indeed.
the New Horizons channel. So yeah, let's get into it. Um, so just starting up at the top, we got Arachne, super easy to take care of. Arachne is also playing the long game, but we just have so many blocks. We have so much damage that leaks through because of traps. The fatigue list specifically run a lot of 0 for 4 blocks as well. So it's really easy to cover up pretty much everything that Arachne is doing. Um, and they tend not to be as like surprise damage push as a hero like New. Uh, so New is also very favored. But there is some tricks, right? If they catch you on a bad hand, you can still get hit with the Bonds of Agony or something. I remember one game, I didn't want to give up my codex. I thought I had enough to block it, and then they had like just the right cards to get one over, and I lost all my codexes for the game. But I still won that game, right? So that's why I feel like new is up in that area. And you tar pit trap the daggers, and sometimes there's just not much that they can do. They don't have the damage that some other heroes do. Fi is also pretty easy, but can definitely high roll you if they line up everything correctly. But otherwise, you block, you wither the storm. It's okay if you don't send something back because they will just run themselves dry, and then you can win in the end game. Classic aggro stuff. Moving down into the heavily favored, KO and Levy are very much on that same vein as Fi, where they are just pushing this aggro. They're discarding all their cards, right? So they fatigue themselves pretty easily. But there is some tricks that they can have up their sleeve. So first, like as a player, you have to know the Riptide player. You have to block very efficiently. So sometimes it's not always about like blocking out all of their attacks because you want to get the most block value out of your cards. And if you mistime that, then they can eke things out. There's also setups like, if they cast bones into CNC, right? Like that's something that can be very, very difficult to deal with. But KO especially is just triggering traps so consistently. He's pretty easy. And then Levy is a little bit trickier because of the flip. So if you're not managing the damage right and you don't push them past the 13, then you can get into a very precarious position where they're using their whole banish as a second hand. Even then, it's still doable. Like if they flip, it's not like game over. I've won plenty of games where Levias have flipped, but I've also lost some games there. Luckily, it's pretty easy to keep them off of that or just kind of manage the game state. Going into the Warriors, they're all kind of grouped together here for the most part. I know that like Kasai in particular, there's like one player on the AGE circuit who's consistently beaten me with Kasai, but I've also beaten plenty of other Kasais. So I think that it's mostly favored, but if they're particularly skilled or knowledgeable of the matchup, then it can get very nuanced very quickly. Bolton is also someone that I have personally not played a lot of games into. We have a lot of Bolton diehards in my area, but they all recognize that Bolton sucks. So they don't play Bolton, but whenever they play Bolton, they know how to play Bolton. So even just at my last armory, I had a game where I was, stripping. I mean, they're blocking with 4 cards every single turn, every single turn, every single turn. I think there was like a 30-point difference or something. And then on one turn, they were able to triple Lumina and literally deal exactly enough damage to kill me. So sometimes that just happens, and that's definitely a matchup that I need more work into. But still pretty heavily favored. If they're not hitting those explosive turns, or if they don't know how to play into Riptide, it's pretty easy just to run away with the game. Katsu is a ninja. We're normally pretty favored into the non-mystic ninjas. But this is another one where just personally, I think I've won more losses than I probably should have. The daggers can really keep them alive in the end game, and splitting their damage right across 2 attacks can be tricky, especially if you're not seeing your codexes or you're not seeing your frailty traps, which I've definitely had happen. And just like most ninjas, they can always high roll, right? You get one bad hand with like 2 codexes in it. Well, then your blocking power's all gone. They're going to connect that hit, and that's the turn where they can really push and pop off. I haven't played Katsu after the Bonds of Agony bans. So that might actually be pretty solidly in the heavily favored, even if I feel like it's trickier than I might think. And then Vincent. Vincent is a little bit similar to Prism in that you're just blocking out. The goal is to keep them off the rune chance. If you can chain that together, great. They're not doing anything. They're taking a bunch of blood debt damage. You have a lot of good blocks. You can really say, I'm not taking any damage. But obviously, Vincent has a lot of ways to push damage through. And if they can get the ball rolling, then that can be a little bit tricky. But still very, very heavily favored. Much like the Brutes, that's a matchup where you just block out and they will fatigue themselves. Moving down to slightly favored. So this one to me feels the most like I need practice into this matchup, and once I do, it'll tick up. But I think that Azuri is the hardest of the assassins, in large part because they're throwing a lot of very relevant on hits on these vanilla 6 attacks, right? So where Nu and Arachne need to play attack reactions and buffs to get the damage up to a point where it demands more than one card, uh, Azuri can either throw out a stealth card and swap in that 6 powered thing, or even just throw the 6 powered thing, and you're not going to be triggering your traps because like obviously they have the daggers and you have a lot of control because you can block with battle worn stuff to pump the daggers and then hit it with a +1 thing. So there's definitely routes to deal that damage. But if you are doing that and then using like then you lose out on your defense reactions to block the things that they're swapping in and losing that flexibility. So it's tricky. I feel like there's more damage that's leaking than you might initially expect, and you're not dealing as much damage because they're playing with a lot of vanilla costed stuff. Obviously, CNC is a huge issue too, right? Whenever they can just swap in a CNC and they have codexes to grab more CNCs, that can be tricky. So I need more practice, but that's why that's in like slightly favored. Whenever it might be more up to heavily favored, since we can just defend around a lot of what they're doing. Betsy, I have very, very little experience into. I haven't played Betsy in a while. The Betsy's I've played against have been easy peasy because wager, their evasion is overpower instead of dominate. Overpower is much easier for us to block, and we can block out these wager attacks that are pumped because of her ability. So she's triggering more traps, and you are getting gold, you are getting vigors, you're getting these different things. But I haven't played much about it, and a Guardian is still Guardian, right? So if they just run a Nothos and block out and swing, that can actually be something that's surprisingly difficult to deal with. Dash, if they're a good dash, they're going to be running the pistol package into you. And that is tricky. And it really is such a skill check of a matchup. But in general, the strategy into dash is to push as much damage as you can early on, and then rely on your traps in the end game whenever everything that they do triggers every single one of your traps. Right, so dash should be starting, I mean, really at like 20 health, because again, they trigger every single trap, and if you time those pitfall traps right, which is harder to do, but you can get them pretty low. But you're going to be blocking so much in the end game just to keep yourself alive that you need to be pushing that damage early. So up until they're pumping and giving their things go again, I wouldn't worry about like blocking the gun much. And this is also why like go again is so important. Like I think that dash is more favored whenever you're on that build of Riptide, like some of the stuff that I've run previously at the AGE circuit that has like those Bolton shots, those Sikkim shots, some things that can go wide and that can have more explosive turns early while still blocking well later, as opposed to something like what Pablo Pintor ran at the Pro Tour, where there's not really a lot of go again. So the on hits are all very relevant, but it can be hard to push like a 12 damage turn on a thing like that. But even then, again, push the damage while you can and then rely on the traps to do the rest. Dash IO is a little bit tricky, just because they're Dash IO and they have instant speed things and they can get a bunch of action points, which can be difficult for Riptide to deal with. But luckily, we also have reactions, right? So if they're trying to bring in stuff at instant speed, we can deal with that with our blocks and, not take as much damage from boom grenades or what have you. But it is a matchup where, should be favored for us. They can definitely high roll. Azalea is a tricky one because for this fatigue list, you run a lot of defense reactions. And so any ranger that runs Dreadbore is going to be a problem. Now, most rangers hate running Dreadbore, right? Because if they're on the aggro list, like Azaleas are on an aggro list and they want to run Death Dealer. But if your local meta knows you, or if you start seeing other lists pop up that are running more defense reactions, it's one inventory slot that makes the world of a difference against those decks. And so I would expect most rangers to run it. even with that, I would say it's slightly favored because there's definitely going to be some that don't run it, and if they don't run it, then it's easy, right? We get around dominate easily, we can block it out. I've also added a bunch of tools in my deck specifically to deal with Dreadbore, so that's where stuff like Standing Order comes in, that's where Oasis Respite comes in, right? These cards, Sigil of Solace, right? Just like keeping life totals up, to help us deal with the fact that we're losing a lot of our defensive tools. I will side out everything and drop down to a 60. Sometimes if I'm feeling spicy, I'll even bring in a Remembrance or two because I want to be grabbing those key cards over and over again to fire. I don't do that as much into Azalea, but Riptide I definitely do, which we'll get to. So I do think it's favored. I have won some games recently into Azalea, but it's tricky, and definitely you can get caught out with some bad hands, and there's definitely a little bit of a game of chicken that you're playing with regards to what bow they decide to run. Enigma also slightly favored. Our traps are really good at killing off their wards, right? So you should be able to control the game state pretty well. But you will hit that end game where they're coming in with all these spectral shields, and if you're running low on attacks or you're running low on traps, it can be difficult to manage that. Some fatigue lists will run Murkmire Grapnel, but no fatigue lists are running a lot of pumps. And so it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get the Murkmire Grapnel to a spot that's going to push through what they have. So maybe end game, right? If they're sitting on a handful of chi, you can send it in and clear the board. But most of the time, they're going to have something that can block it out, and they're going to do that. I like Vambrace. I think that Vambrace is something that a lot of other decks aren't currently running, but it's really nice here because we run a lot of blues, but we also run a lot of like things that just require 2 mana or 2 resources to attack. And so you'll have an extra resource floating around quite often. Maybe you cleared arsenal because you put a trap into your arsenal that did an attack, and then you arsenal and then pitch the card you were going to pitch to load and fire. Now you have an extra resource, and you can turn that into just like a little bit more damage, a little bit more board clear. So I find that helps a lot. And then Battering Bolt is key. Battering Bolt, Remembrance to grab back your Battering Bolts. Your Codex is to grab back your Battering Bolts, because that is how, once you hit that end game where they're all on chi, battering is how you win, right? That is how you push the damage through. That's how you get rid of the cards in the deck to push through. Viscerai also have been slightly favored. Viscerai is one of those decks that is going to trigger just about every single trap, so you're going to be dealing a lot of damage, and you're going to be able to stop a lot of the damage, but arcane damage overall is difficult for us to deal with. Even defensive decks tend to not run many blues, and sideboard slots are tight, and so we're not running a ton of extra AB to support, like we don't have the blues to support AB3. We don't have the blues to support AB3, and AB3 is a lot to ask whenever we want to be using those equipment slots for these other items. So again, mostly favored, but they're going to be leaking
Viscerai
quite a bit of
doesn't
damage.
really do more than 1 arcane damage.
Was that?
Viscerai doesn't
Oh,
do
that's
more
right.
than, yeah.
Yeah. They'll do 2 sometimes, right? Like I think that you do have to run 2 into Viscerai because they do have some tools that'll close out the game that deal that 2 damage. But even just from like a mana standpoint, like you do not have a lot of resources to send into that. So if they're just coming in for like 1 or 2, rune chance, you can kind of deal with that. But if they're hitting that like 3, 4, 5 mark, like they're going to be leaking some damage, and that's on top of their go wide turns. But if you can get the traps in, if you can keep them off their tempo, like that definitely is something that can be won. Moving down into the 50-50 range, I have Prism here in the 50-50. And again, I think this is another one that is like particularly skill checky on the Prism side, right? Because for us, we're really, really good at blocking, and stuff like Tar Pit Trap can just shut them down. So my way of dealing with Prism is typically to starve the soul. I'm blocking everything as much as I can just to keep them off that soul so they cannot pop off and litter the board with the figments or get that loop going. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I played a game earlier today on Talishar where it was like turn 3 or 4 and they just had the nuts and they looped me, and I was like, all right, this is over. But I've also played against plenty of Prisms who either underestimated Riptide or didn't know how to fully play against it. And in those cases, if you're the confident Riptide, you can walk away with the game. So it forces them to have the cards to get that loop. And if they don't have that loop, you should be in a pretty good spot to win. Bravo's here in the 50-50. If they're on a really defense reaction oriented build, like I hear there's one going around that has a lot of D-reacts. I haven't played that really into that really, but if that's the case, it gets a lot easier, right? Because stuff like battering bolt, I mean, our whole deck is built around shutting down D-reacts. So the more D-reacts they run, the easier it gets. But they have a Nothos, right? That 4 they can just block out and swing 4, block out and swing 4, and then once all of our traps are gone, they can still close out the game with these dominated things. And of course, they're the one that is most able to do the CNC pummel, which is a really difficult thing for Riptides to deal with. So I'd say 50-50, but that's really build dependent. I think some builds are going to be more in that slightly unfavored range. And then some are going to be, maybe even into slightly favored depending on the D-react situation. Rhinar is interesting because it is... Rhinar is 50-50 because they are literally rolling dice and you're seeing what gets intimidated out of your hand. And sometimes the difference between a game can be what gets intimidated. If the intimidates go your way, this should be pretty easy along the lines of Levia, along the lines of KO. You're blocking things, you're blocking efficiently, you're managing the damage. They're taking a lot of damage because they're triggering traps, and they're fatiguing themselves because they're discarding everything. But obviously, if they're hitting your traps with Intimidate and you're stuck with like attack actions that you have to block with, it's going to be harder for you to maintain that tempo. The most important thing with Rhinar is just keeping that arsenal stocked. So Rhinar is a matchup where I'm always drawing the card with Enlightened Strike. Things like Ponder, right, from your codexes, like just like anything, or even just playing your turns going, hey, I'm not going to overblock this, because if I don't overblock this, then I can arsenal that D-react, and that's going to, then you're going to get full block value out of that. And as long as it's an arsenal, you're not going to have it be intimidated. So, yeah. Decimator builds, I think, are 50-50. I feel like that can shift a little bit depending on what build they're on, and again, just skill levels, but you just have to absolutely play the value game. That's one where you're blocking with 1 or 2 cards every turn. You're pushing those breakpoints. You're identifying your power turns, like if you're on the go again stuff, what is the most that you can do there. And I could see this being a matchup too that gets better. It's been a while since I played against a full Decimator build. But that gets better with some of the new aim tools that we got, right? So now that we have a way to just give Murky Water an aim counter to close out the game, I think that's going to be helpful in Decimator. I think that's going to be helpful in a lot of the Guardian matches, which can sometimes get very, very close. Now we also have a tool to deal with that. But I still think a Decimator is 50-50, and it's going to be a long game. Moving into slightly unfavored, we have Riptide and slightly unfavored. So if you're in the true mirror, right, fatigue versus fatigue, it's a 50-50, and it just depends on who hits their CNCs, who's able to keep the other one off their arsenal with like sedation shots, or battering bolts are huge, right? But whenever you're going into an aggro list, or even like, a more mid-range list that's running some pumps or some go again in addition to the more defense-oriented stuff, it gets hard. So they're going to side out their traps. You're also going to side out as many D-reacts as you can, like what I was talking about with Azalea. And just try to push what you can through. If they're on the aggro list, they're going to be throwing a lot of damage, and you're going to do your best to block everything that you can and send similar stuff back. Yeah, and that's the matchup. I like it. I really, really enjoy playing the Riptide Mirror. I think there's a lot of nuance there that I particularly enjoy. So don't run away from mirrors on Talishar. Next we have Max and Nitro Mechanoid. Those are really kind of like one and the same in my book. Nitro Mechanoid is tough in that they're just these super wide turns. You can only block so much on those turns. And more importantly, they are often doing those turns in a way that avoids your frailty traps, right? So they're going to be boosting to set up the high octane. But once they start going and really going, like if you maybe saving a trap to see kind of like how the turn plays out or something like that, like you're going to potentially lose some value. So they just go so wide on those turns. Sedation shots are really helpful. CNC is really helpful. Anything that is going to destroy their arsenal and make it so that they can't just kind of like sit on those key combo pieces is going to be really helpful. That's why you'll see a lot of sedation shots in these kinds of lists. Specifically for those decks that are like, we're setting up this big combo play later.
Tally and I were
This,
talking about this matchup in particular, and
yeah,
that like the new card does a
I
huge
was
amount
just
of
about to
percentage
say,
into this.
yeah, I think that the new card is going to be huge. I think it's going to
Especially
help
for fatigue.
across the board. I think it's going to be great in fatigue. It's going to help with those decks. Like really a lot of them max, right? Like Nitro Mechanoid, but also Teklo, who might be sitting on stuff. It's going to help with Victor. It's going to help with Bravo. Any of those decks that are trying to like sit on a CNC to wait for those pummels to come along. It's going to be good into, I think, Prism as well, because they'll often be sitting on like, you know, their ALS or something until they hit that rebirth to try to like set up the loop. So the new card is going to be great. I'm going to be putting 3 of it in. I'm big on Intoxicating Shot, but I might even cut Intoxicating Shot for this new card because it's just good. And I'm excited to play it. Next we have Zen. Zen I have in slightly unfavored. I've been really struggling into Zen. I know that Pablo ran his fatigue-oriented list in part because he felt like it had a pretty good Zen matchup. Relatively speaking, at least. I think Weakest Link is huge here. So Weakest Link is crazy expensive right now. I do not have enough copies. I borrowed one at like the last AGE or something. But I do think the fact that that is so incredibly disruptive to Zen and that you can codex that over and over again, right? Like these fatigue decks are really good at codexing those 2 cost targets. And so I could see it getting better, but it's one that I've been struggling with because the fatigue deck was built on this value game, right? It is, you are getting more value for your cards than they are. And that's not really the game that Zen is playing. Zen is hitting with these big, explosive, wide turns. And so even if you're sitting on like, 5 sync belows, right? Or 5-0 for 4 defense reactions, because the damage is so split up and because the damage is so monumentous, that can actually be hard to kind of like block out. So you just got to keep your life totals high. You got to chain those disruptive attacks as best you can. Battering is great. Weakest Link is great. DNC is fine. Remorseless is fine. They don't care about the damage, but you do kind of whatever you can there. Then we have Victor. Victor's a tough one. Victor does not run a lot of defense reactions. They will side out their defense reactions, but they still have ways to block for 4 really easily, which really throws off our math. And of course, they're going to be winning like all of the clashes because you run just so many defense reactions. So everything is losing. Every now and then you'll win one, right? Because like we do have these 6 powered things that are helpful. Some fatigue builds are on more of like the bull side, right? So they might run like a Findle's Fighting Spirit or the Bastion one,
The
right, from
Voltide.
Mistveil. Yeah, those decks I feel like you have a few surprise 7 attacks in there that help you win, but it's tough. I've beaten some Victors. My recent Victors games have been much closer than they have been in the past. Like I said, I think that the new arm piece is like really crucial in kind of helping with that. But it's still going to be a tough one because they are just so efficient. I do think it is easier in this fatigue style deck than with like an aggro deck because the crush shuts down so much of what you're trying to do. But in the fatigue, like most of the crushes aren't that bad. There's going to be turns that really mess you up. Like sometimes they just have the perfect crush card for the hand that you had. But there's going to be plenty of other times where it's like, okay, my attacks lose go again, but I just load and fire or I send a CNC or whatever, right? Like we're used to playing these 2 card hands. We're not going super wide. Even if the attack power is reduced a little bit, it's like, okay, my 6 powered thing is coming in for 4 now. You still have to answer that, like there's some ways, but it is really hard because of how efficiently they block and they have that giant fridge, right? So they're going to be able to, any tricks that you have, they're going to be able to cover those breakpoints. And yeah, so it's a tricky one. Then we have down in the pretty much unwinnable. We have Kano, as we mentioned, Arcane Barrier can be tough. We do not have a lot of blues, so this is where like it's hard for us to do the 3AB. We have some tools like Oasis Respite, but they are often playing around Oasis Respite, and you, as the Riptide player, have to know really what to Oasis Respite and when.
You're
If
also
you want
just
to get
fundamentally really slow.
Yeah, exactly. Like they can pitch stack, even if they don't. Like it's just like they just have so many ways of popping off. You're giving them a lot of control. Your best cards here are gonna be like your sedation shots and stuff. So you cut all your red defense reactions. If it's a red defense reaction, you cut it. You sideboard in the remembrance just because they're yellows. And then you just hope that they whiff and you hope that you can push stuff. And I've had games that have gotten very, very close. I've had a couple games recently where the attack on the stack is what is going to kill them, and then they do Kano things, they blind flip, and they get me. So it's possible. This is another matchup that I think will probably get better with the new card. Maybe I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt, because on one hand you can grab like these blue traps and destroy their arsenal, right? So you're forcing them off it. It's inertia mega sized on a stick, right? Um, but of course, once you play that, you're playing your blue, and then they can do things. So we'll see. And then Teklo is another really, really challenging one because they right like I was mentioning, the fatigue deck is built on forcing them to block with at least 2 cards or you chip damage, and it does that by saying you cannot play defense reactions from hand, which is how people efficiently block cards. Teklo flips that on his head and has a bunch of equipment that can block all of those breakpoints. So it's very, very tough. The good thing is that they're going to trigger all of your traps, especially in the late game, right? Once they have their Evo stuff set up. And a lot of their evasion is overpower, which is something that we're really good at evading. So I have won games against Teklo. I don't think I've won a game against a Kano yet, but I've won games against Teklo because you get lucky. And if you want to get really, really spicy for the Teklo, Give and Take is a really solid card into Teklo because all of the Evos are actions. So you will be able to recur something if they block with a Give and Take. So like the whenever I beat the Teklo, I was on a hyper fatigue list that ran Give and Take as well as Warmonger's Recital, and I would put the Warmonger's Recital on the Give and Take. And so if it hits, it goes to the bottom of the library, and if they block it with actions, then I get to grab something and put it on top, that Codex or whatever. So yeah, but that's neither here nor there. I don't think that style of deck is good into like anybody else, but there is some like weird tech things. But it's going to be hard. Luckily, not a ton of people are playing it. Um, yeah, and that's the matchup spread as I see it, as my experience dictates.
So yeah, I know that this one went a little bit longer than a lot of the other ones, which is fine because we talked a
I'm a
lot more.
windbag.
we we talked a lot about some of the other stuff in the previous video that we had, and a lot of the stuff kind of overlaps in those builds. While this is more of a fundamentally different build than most people are used to, because Fatigue Riptide kind of blipped out of the radar for a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Um, and it's recently kind of come back. So like, what's your thoughts on this list in the meta? Like, what made it come back is a better way to put
Well,
it.
I think that defensive lists in general, regardless of the class, are always going to be worse than aggro lists at the start of a set. And that's just because you don't know what threats you're up against, right? You can make your best guesses, but like in general, aggro is going to be better at the start of a set. So I think what we're seeing now is like, okay, we know what Zen is doing, right? The Zen builds are settled. The new builds that are countering the Zen builds are settled. And so that allows us to like grab the cards that are going to best allow us to win those matchups. So that's where, like, again, if you look at Pablo's list, who I think is probably the most successful like fatigue oriented list that we've seen in a minute from Riptide. Like he's running 3 weakest links, right? Like I said, like because those are just really good into those. But I don't know if that's something that we would have thought to run necessarily early on, or maybe we were just underestimating Zen early on, right? So I think that part of it is just like we know now how to adapt and how to react. I think that is a big part. I don't think that like fatigue has ever like really gone away. I think that we've also just gotten so many tools that seem to be really helpful on the aggressive side, right? Like we got things like Stone Rain that can be really huge for aggro lists, and we're not making use of the aim stuff. So for my list, I'm just really experimenting with the arms piece. Um, but
As a
yeah,
finisher, yeah.
I do think he's good. I think it's just been like waiting for things, and and honestly probably like the Azalea and the Riptides coming up, right? Like they just require us to shift our deck building a little bit, and that's taken a little bit of adjustment. But now that things are a little bit more settled, I think that hybrid lists are in a good spot, or hybrid or fatigue lists, at least until Rosetta, and then like the whole meta shifts, and then it'll probably be aggro again until things come back. But we'll
Re-
see.
So why do you think that the aggro is going to be a thing? Because me and Tally were talking about it a little bit. And, and we figured that because of how aggro works, his spread is technically better right now for the pre-meta.
Yeah,
However, the aim counter list has a more flexible time on having multiple AB, which I think that having
yeah,
two AB is going to be really important, at
yeah.
minimum, for the new wizards and the rune blades.
I think it's gonna shift. So I don't know. This is a lot of speculation on my part, on all of our parts, but I think that you're correct that like a Cheerios redliner style, right? Not like running redline, but just that idea of like you're running all of these 0 for 4 arrows, you're running all of these red pumps,
Yeah, the
and
aggro
that is how
list.
you're pushing damage and you're winning. But I think that like an aim list, like, this is where like the line gets kind of blurred, right? Like I would consider an aim list that is running a lot of things like like Fletcher Red Tail, right? Or Fletcher Blue Tail. Like there are these other 2 block pumps that are really good and push damage and take about the same amount of cards from your hand as like the Cheerios style build. But that's gonna have more blues, right? Because you need that to fuel that. And so I could see like an aggressive aim list that is going taller, like a taller aggro instead of these wider aggros that you might see on like this Cheerios thing. I think that's going to be like the baseline of where to start. I don't know if like a fatigue oriented deck is going to be all that better into the Rosetta heroes, because they seem to want to go to the late game, right? They want to banish a lot of Earth cards and then kind of like unlock these extra abilities. They have a lot of flexibility with the meld cards. There's a lot of life gain involved, so I think it's going to be hard for us to close things out.
Something in the middle, I think, was about what would happen.
Yeah, and that's why I
So
think it's
hence
going to be
hybrid.
like, yeah, it's going to be hybrid, but I think it's going to be hybrid with less reliance on traps and more just like and that's why I say like it's going to be an aggressive list that's running blues instead of like a defensive list that is looking to outvalue, or a red line list. It's going to be similar to like what was happening whenever Icelander was around, right? It was really hard for Riptide to like push through the damage with Icelander, and if you wanted to have a competitive deck, you had to have like a little bit more blues in there, and I think we're going to see something like that come back.
I remember during that meta that I made the conscious decision it's either wizard or illusionist, and I was like, I'm just going to give up the wizard matchup because I don't think there's
Yep.
enough I can do. So
Yep.
we just tackle the illusionist matchup.
Yep. That's exactly it.
All right, well, appreciate it. That's a hell of a lot of info for fatigue, which I think that a lot of people haven't really put too many details into words. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have questions. Your list will be down below. Um, as all of ours, it's going to be a work in progress. And once Rosetta comes out, obviously it's going to be mute. But this is a really good starting point for people that want to try to navigate into it either during the season, just to like play their one last event, or to get started with it, or the moment that Rosetta starts and to have some form of basis to get jump started.
Yeah. And if you test this list, let me know how it goes. I don't have a lot of time to like grind games, so like let me know how's it working for you? What changes are you doing, and what's working, what's not? Let's solve this because I got tournaments at the end of August.
All right,
Oh, and
appreciate
if you're
being
in
on.
Battlehard in San Diego, say hi. Sorry, there's that Battlehard in San Diego. I'll be there. That's in my hometown. So if you're coming out or if you're there, like run Riptide and say hi. There's a lot of good Riptides in SoCal.
Let them win.
Yeah, exactly.